Nobody really looked at Jake Mercer twice. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and blended into the walls without trying. Medium height, medium build, with short brown hair that never quite looked combed, and a face that had seen enough sun and wind to look older than his 34 years. He wore the same worn brown jacket almost every day, the one with the frayed left cuff and the small burn mark near the collar that he never bothered to explain. He drank his coffee black, ate whatever was available without complaint, and never raised his voice. He had been a soldier once, 3 tours in contested zones, back when Earth's early expansion into deep space had made enemies faster than it made allies. He had been good at the job, not flashy, not decorated with big speeches or dramatic moments, just quietly, consistently good. The kind of soldier who kept his unit alive by paying attention to small things. The kind who noticed when a floor felt wrong underfoot, or when a hallway was too quiet, or when the air had the particular stillness that came just before something bad happened. He had 2 medals from those years. They were in a box somewhere in his small rented quarters on Vithara Station. He did not look at them often. His discharge had come 3 years ago. It was not the result of any scandal or failure. The contract had simply ended. The program had been restructured, and Jake had found himself standing on a civilian transit platform with a bag over his shoulder and no particular plan. He had drifted for a little while. Odd work, short contracts, the kind of jobs that got filled by people who were good with their hands and did not ask too many questions. Eventually, he had landed at Harrow Logistics, a mid-sized supply company that operated freight and humanitarian cargo routes along the outer edges of compact controlled space. The pay was not impressive. The work was not exciting. But it was steady, and it kept him moving, which was the only thing he had really needed since the discharge. His supervisor was a woman named Diane Cole, efficient, fair, slightly impatient with people who missed deadlines. She had reviewed Jake's file when he applied, noted his military background with the brief interest of someone who appreciated reliability over heroics, and hired him on a short trial that became permanent after 6 weeks. She wrote in his first review that he was dependable, unremarkable, no complaints. Jake had read it and nodded once. That felt about right to him. He had been running supply routes through the Vethara neutral zone for 2 years. The zone was a wide stretch of battered space, sitting between territories that had once belonged to 2 warring powers, the Solvari Dominion to the north and the Kreth Alliance to the south. The war between them had ended badly for everyone, the way most wars did, and what remained was a patchwork of abandoned outposts, broken infrastructure, and political agreements that nobody fully trusted. The Galactic Compact had stepped in to manage it, which mostly meant sending observers and writing long reports that nobody acted on. Humans were allowed to operate in the zone under limited clearance. Nobody felt strongly enough about them one way or another to keep them out. They were a young species, only a few decades into proper deep space contact, and most of the older powers regarded them the way experienced adults sometimes regarded young teenagers, with mild interest, occasional amusement, and the comfortable assumption that they were not yet a serious factor in anything important. Jake was fine with that. He had no interest in being a serious factor in anything important. He just wanted to do his runs, get paid, and drink his bad coffee in peace. The route he drove most often took him through 7 checkpoints across 3 dead sectors and ended at a small distribution hub near the Compact's forward observation post. He had done it 47 times. He knew every delay, every guard rotation, every patch of unstable terrain that would shake the drive couplings loose if he took the corner too fast. He knew which checkpoints needed a smile and a ration pack to get through without a 2-hour wait. He knew the sounds his transport made when it was happy and the sounds it made when it was about to give him a problem. On his 48th run, it gave him a problem. The drive coupling and the rear housing went on a stretch of dead road about 3 kilometers from the ruins of outpost Vel Saren. The transport shuddered, through a warning light he had seen twice before. and rolled to a slow, reluctant stop in the middle of a cracked gray plain with nothing visible in any direction except broken ground and the distant outline of the outpost's collapsed antenna tower. Jake sat in the cab for a moment, looked at the warning light, and finished his coffee. Then he climbed out, pulled his kit from the side hatch, and crouched down to look at the coupling. It was fixable. It would take about 40 minutes, and one replacement part he was fairly sure he had in the rear storage bin. He was not worried. He had fixed this exact problem before, in worse conditions, with less equipment. He had been working for about 10 minutes when he heard the sound. It was small. He almost missed it. The wind across the plain had a low, steady moan to it, and the kind of silence that empty places carry, that thick, heavy quiet that fills places where people used to be but aren't anymore. Against that silence, the sound barely registered at first. But Jake had spent years training himself to pay attention to things that barely registered. He stopped what he was doing and stayed very still. There it was again. Small, wet, frightened. The kind of sound a living thing makes when it has been scared for a long time and is running out of the energy to keep being scared. It was coming from inside the collapsed medical annex at the edge of the old outpost, about 60 meters off the road. Jake stayed still for 4 full seconds. He looked at the annex. He looked at the road. He looked at the flat gray sky above him, which offered no opinion either way. Then he set his tool down, picked up his cargo knife from the kit out of simple habit, and walked toward the sound. He did not run. He did not hesitate. He just walked, the way a man walks when he has already made a decision and sees no point in making a performance of it. His jacket shifted in the wind. His boots moved quietly over the broken ground. Inside that collapsed annex, something small and frightened was waiting. Jake Mercer went to find out what it was. The inside of the annex smelled like dust and old metal, and something faintly chemical that Jake could not name. The roof had partially collapsed on the far end, letting in a thin gray light that fell across broken furniture, overturned supply crates, and the kind of mess that came from a place being abandoned in a hurry. Cables hung from the ceiling like dead vines. Pieces of equipment lay scattered across the floor, some cracked open, some still blinking with the last of their battery power. Jake moved carefully, stepping around the debris, following the sound. He found her behind a fallen ceiling panel near the back wall. A Solvari child, small enough that she could have curled up inside one of the supply crates, with room to spare. She was pressed against the wall, with her knees pulled to her chest and both arms wrapped tight around them. Her skin was the pale gray-blue of her species, and it was flickering. Jake did not know much about Solvari biology, but he knew enough to understand that the flickering meant she was frightened and exhausted, and had been both for a long time. She looked up at him with large, dark eyes that caught what little light there was. Jake crouched down slowly, so he was not standing over her. He kept his hands visible. He spoke in a low, even voice, the kind he had used a long time ago with scared civilians in bad places. "Hey," he said quietly, "it is okay. I am not going to hurt you." She didn't understand the words, but she did not move away from him either. She watched him with those wide eyes, and her skin kept flickering, but something in the pattern shifted, just slightly, just enough to tell him she was listening. He was still crouched there, still trying to figure out the best way to get her out safely, when the far wall came in. It simply gave way, a section of already damaged paneling that had been pushed from the outside, falling inward with a flat, heavy crash that sent dust rolling across the floor in a low wave. Jake was on his feet before the sound finished echoing, the cargo knife in his hand, his body already turning to put himself between the child and whatever was coming through. There were 8 of them. Kreth. He recognized them immediately. Digitigrade legs, narrow shoulders, reinforced forearms that ended in the long, curved blades they grew from their own bone. They spread out, without being told to, the way a trained group does, filling the available space, cutting off the angles to the exits. They moved with the loose, easy confidence of creatures who had done this kind of thing many times, and did not expect it to take long. They communicated in the fast clicking sound Kreth used between themselves, low and rapid, and Jake did not need to understand the language to understand what they were saying. They had found something alive in their claimed ruins. They were deciding how quickly to end it. Jake took in the room in the space of one breath. He counted the bodies, the positions, the distances. He noted the debris patterns on the floor, where the footing was bad, where a person could move fast, and where they could not. He looked at the ceiling, at the hanging cables, at the two corners of the room that the thin light did not reach at all. He felt the weight of the tension cable still clipped to his belt from the repair work outside. He registered the layout of the support struts running along the near wall. He had no armor, no backup coming. He had a knife, a cable, a dark room, and 11 minutes of training that had never really left him. The first Kreth came fast. Jake did not try to meet the blade straight on. He moved sideways into the debris, forcing the Kreth to adjust its angle, and used the half-second that bought him to drive his elbow into the joint between its forearm and blade housing, the one soft point in their arm structure that a human medic had once pointed out to him in a briefing he had attended mostly out of boredom. The Kreth stumbled. Jake moved past it and deeper into the dark corner of the room, pulling the child with one hand as he went. He used the dark like a tool. Kreth echolocation was excellent in open space, but struggled badly in rooms full of layered metallic debris. The clicks and returns came back wrong, confused, bouncing off the broken equipment in patterns that were hard to read. Jake knew this because he had read every available file on Kreth physiology 2 years ago, on a slow transit run, because he had nothing else to do, and because knowing things about the species you worked near seemed like basic common sense. The second blade caught him across the left shoulder. He felt the burn of it, but did not stop. He let the pain sit at the edge of his mind, noted it the way he would note a warning light on the transport, something to be dealt with later, not now. He used the cable to take down a second Kreth, looping it low around its legs as it crossed a patch of unstable floor, bringing it hard into a support strut with a crash that shook the wall. The third blade opened his side. The fourth he took on his forearm, putting it there on purpose, deliberately, because the alternative was letting it reach the child, and that was not an option he was considering. He kept moving. He used the corners, the debris, the bad footing. He moved the Kreth into each other's way, forced them to hesitate, made the room work against them instead of for them. He was bleeding from 4 places by the time the 6th one withdrew, and his left arm was not responding quite the way he wanted it to, but he was still on his feet, and still between the child and every exit. The last 2 Kreth stopped. They stood at the edge of the dark and looked at him, this bleeding, silent human who had not run, had not begged, had not done any of the things prey was supposed to do. There was something in the way they went still that Jake recognized. He had seen it before, in other places, in other kinds of trouble. It was the moment when something that had come in expecting an easy outcome started doing a different kind of calculation. They withdrew into the darkness outside. Jake stood where he was for a long time after the sound of them faded. Then his legs made a quiet decision, without asking his opinion, and he went down onto one knee. He pressed his jacket hard against his side. His breathing was controlled, slow and even, the way he had been trained to breathe when his body wanted to panic. The child crept forward from the corner and pressed her small back against his. He reached behind him with his good arm and kept her there. "You are okay," he said quietly. To her, and possibly also to himself. "You are okay." He did not know how long they stayed like that. Long enough that the gray light coming through the collapsed roof began to fade. Long enough that his legs went numb. Long enough that the silence outside stretched into the kind of stillness that felt finally like it was going to hold. Then he reached down with one bloody hand and triggered his emergency beacon. After that, everything went dark. Nobody had been watching Outpost Velsaren for a long time. The outpost had been abandoned years ago when the front lines of the Solvari-Kreth War moved away and left it behind like a piece of furniture nobody wanted to carry. The compact had listed it as a non-active site, sent a small crew to deactivate the main systems, and then quietly forgotten about it. There was nothing there worth monitoring. No personnel, no active equipment, no reason to look. Except that 2 environmental sensors in the upper corners of the old medical annex had never been properly shut down. They were small, old units, the kind that recorded temperature, atmosphere, and motion as part of a basic safety system, built to keep running on minimal power for years without anyone needing to tend to them. They were not military grade. They were not designed for surveillance. They recorded in low-resolution infrared, and the footage they produced was grainy and dark and frequently cut out when the power dipped. But they had been recording, and on the day Jake Mercer walked into that annex, they had captured everything. The footage was 17 minutes long. A compact archive technician named Pete Garza found it first, not because he was looking for it, but because he ran a routine sweep of all old monitoring signals in the zone as part of a weekly maintenance task that mostly turned up nothing. He flagged it because the motion data was unusual. He expected, when he opened the file, to find some kind of animal activity or equipment malfunction. He watched the first 4 minutes with his coffee going cold beside him. Then he sent it up the chain without finishing his coffee, without writing his usual summary note, and without taking his eyes off the screen. The footage moved through the compact's internal network with a speed that quiet, unremarkable files almost never moved. Within 2 hours, it had reached 3 separate intelligence desks across 2 different species. Within 4 hours, it had been watched in full by people whose job it was to assess threats and capabilities and shifts in the balance of things. Within 6 hours, it was the most watched clip in the entire compact intelligence network. Solvari High Commander Vera Solketh watched it 3 times before she said a single word. She was not an easy person to impress. She had led the Velsoran elite for 11 years. She had fought in 6 major engagements and advised on 40 more. She had seen acts of courage that were recorded in Solvari memory as permanent examples of what a warrior could be. She had a precise and unsentimental understanding of combat, of biology, of what bodies could and could not do under pressure. She watched the grainy infrared footage of one human, with no armor and no proper weapon, hold a room against 8 Kreth for 11 minutes while keeping a child alive behind him. She watched him take blade after blade and keep moving. She watched him use the dark and the debris and the terrain the way a person uses familiar tools, calmly, deliberately, without panic. She watched the moment the last 2 Kreth stopped and went still and chose to leave. Then she forwarded the footage to the High Command with 1 line of text beneath it. It said, "Identify and retrieve the human." The Kreth Analytical Bureau received the footage through a different channel. They watched it 4 times. Then they opened a new file and gave it a heading that translated roughly as Reassessment of Human Threat Parameters. The analysts who filled that file were careful people who dealt in facts and measurements and avoided strong language. They used strong language anyway. They noted that the human had shown knowledge of Kreth physiology that should not have been available to a civilian logistics worker. They noted that his movement patterns indicated formal military training of a high order. They noted that he had used available materials, a cable, the room layout, The darkness, with a level of adaptability that their models had not predicted for a member of a species so newly arrived in deep space contact. They noted, most carefully of all, that he had not been protecting himself. His every decision in that room had been built around keeping the child behind him, even when protecting himself would have been the easier choice. The file grew long very quickly. At a compact observation post 3 sectors away, a group of diplomatic observers from several different species gathered around a shared screen to watch the footage together. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when people are seeing something they did not expect to see. A Denari attaché named Suval, who had spent 20 years studying newly contacted species and writing careful reports about their potential, watched the whole 17 minutes without speaking. When it ended, he sat back in his chair and asked in a very even voice whether humans always did things like this. Nobody in the room gave him a satisfying answer. Back on the Thara station, Pete Garza had been called into 3 separate briefings by the end of the day. He answered every question he was asked, confirmed the footage was unedited and the sensors were legitimate, and then went back to his desk and sat quietly for a while. He had watched the clips 6 times now. He kept coming back to the same moment, the part near the end, after the last Kreth had gone, when the child crept forward and pressed herself against the human's back, and the human reached behind him with his good arm and held her there. Pete Garza was not a sentimental person by nature, but he sat at his desk for a long time after that. A Solvari recovery team reached Outpost Velsarin 14 hours after Jake's beacon triggered. They came in fast and ready, weapons up, expecting complications. What they found instead was a collapsed annex, 8 signs of recent Kreth presence, and 1 human unconscious on the floor, with 4 closed wounds that had been pressed shut by a jacket he had used as a bandage. He was still on his knees. He had not fallen over. He had stayed in position even after losing consciousness, his body holding the shape his mind had decided on, still leaning toward the child, still between her and the door. The child, Velsen Aura, was dehydrated and frightened, and had not made a sound since the Kreth left. She was 5 years old by Solvari count, the daughter of a council member who had been listed as missing after an evacuation transport lost its route and went dark. She had been alone in that annex for 2 days before Jake Mercer's transport broke down on the road outside. When the recovery team found them, she was holding his hand. She was holding it with all 4 fingers, pressed tight, the way small children hold on to the thing that kept them safe when they are not yet sure the danger is really over. The team leader stood in the doorway of the annex for a moment before he gave his team the order to move in. He was a veteran of 4 campaigns and not given to pausing in doorways. But he stood there for that moment anyway, looking at the unconscious human and the small child and the hand that was holding the hand, and he did not quite have the words for what he was seeing. He filed his report later that night. He wrote it carefully and accurately and without any extra language. But at the bottom, in the section marked Additional Observations, he wrote 1 sentence that his superiors would read several times before deciding to leave it in. It said, "The child did not want to let go." The first thing Jake noticed was the pillow. Not the ceiling above him, which was unfamiliar. Not the faint hum of a life support system running somewhere beneath the floor. Not even the dull, distant ache that was spread across his left shoulder and his side and his forearm like something that had been hurting for a long time and was only now introducing itself properly. The pillow. It was real and soft, and it was under his head. He lay still and looked at the ceiling for a while. It was pale gray and smooth, and clearly not built for a human facility. The proportions of the room were slightly off, in the way that rooms designed for a different species always were. The ceiling a little too high, the walls a little too close together, the light coming from panels set at angles that made the shadows fall in unfamiliar directions. Everything about it said he was somewhere that had not been built with him in mind. But someone had put a pillow under his head. Someone had found one, or made one, or specifically gone looking for one, because they had understood that he would need it. He turned his head slowly and looked at the rest of the room. There was a blanket over him, thick and warm, the kind of warmth that settled into tired muscles and made them want to stay still a little longer. There was a container of water on a low shelf within easy reach of his right hand, placed there deliberately at exactly the right distance by someone who had thought about it. His jacket was on the same shelf, cleaned and folded with more care than he had ever folded it himself. His wounds had been closed. He could feel the difference, the tight, slightly strange sensation of Solvari bioweave working under his skin, knitting things back together at a speed that human medicine could not match. His left shoulder was held in a firm brace. His forearm was wrapped in something cool and smooth. Whoever had treated him had known what they were doing, and had done it well. He was alive. He was warm. Someone had taken care of him. Jake let out a slow breath and looked at the far wall. That was when he saw them. There were 12 of them, standing along the far wall in a line that was perfectly straight, perfectly still, the way a line of people stands when they have been trained for years to hold a position without moving. They wore deep blue armor, full Solvari battle dress, the kind that Jake had only ever seen in intelligence files and at a distance. The armor was polished and detailed and carried markings along the chest and shoulders that he did not know how to read, but understood instinctively were important. Their faces were calm and still and fixed on him. They were not guarding him. He understood that immediately, with the part of his mind that had spent years reading rooms and reading people. Guards watched doors. Guards watched the space around their target. These 12 were watching him, only him, with a focused, deliberate attention that had nothing to do with security. He had never seen the posture before, but something about it made the back of his neck feel strange. It was the posture of people who were paying their respects. He moved his eyes to the corner of the room without turning his head. A Kreth officer stood there, alone, unarmed, with both forearm blades fully retracted and his hands held open at his sides. He was not in scavenger gear. He was in formal dress, the neutral markings of an official observer, the kind worn only in situations that required a recognized witness. He stood completely still and watched Jake with dark, steady eyes. Jake looked at him for a moment. Then he looked away without any particular reaction, because reacting to a thing before he understood it fully had never been a habit he allowed himself. There was a chair pulled close to the medical platform on his right side. A woman was sitting in it. She was Solvari, tall, even-seated, dressed in silver and white that Jake recognized as council rank from the files he had read 2 years ago on a boring transit run. Her bioluminescence was running in a slow, steady pattern, gold and amber, moving under her skin in long, even pulses. He did not know enough about Solvari bioluminescent expression to read it the way her own people could. But there was something in the quality of it, in the control of it, that reminded him of the way a person breathes when they are holding something very large and very heavy inside them, and working hard to keep it from showing on their face. She had been watching him since he opened his eyes. She watched him look at the ceiling, look at the pillow, look at the 12 warriors, look at the Kreth officer. She watched him do all of it quietly, without panic, without any of the loud confusion that people sometimes came up out of after heavy sedation. When his eyes finally came to hers, she held his gaze. They looked at each other for a moment in silence. Then she spoke. Her human standard was careful and precise, shaped by someone who had learned it from study rather than conversation. But it was clear and fully understandable. My daughter has not let go of your jacket since they brought it to her, she said. "She asks every hour if you are awake yet." Jake was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression, small and brief, there and then gone, like a light passing behind a window. "How is she?" he asked. "She is well," the woman said, "because of you." He looked at the ceiling again for a second. Then he said, "Good. That is good." He paused. "I could really use some of that water." For 1/2 second, nothing happened. Then one of the 12 elite warriors along the far wall stepped forward. He crossed the room in 4 measured steps, picked up the water container from the shelf, and held it out to Jake with both hands. It was a careful gesture, deliberate, two-handed, the kind of gesture that in Solvari custom carried a meaning that Jake did not know. The warrior's hands were not quite steady. Jake took the container, drank from it slowly, and set it down on the platform beside him. "Thank you," he said. The warrior stepped back into the line. He did not say anything. None of the 12 said anything. But something shifted in the room. A small, collective change in the air. The way the feeling in a room changes when something that was held tight begins, just slightly, to ease. The woman in the chair watched Jake settle back against the pillow. She was quiet for a while. The gold-amber pattern of her bioluminescence moved slowly under her skin. "You are confused," she said, "about why they are here." "A little," Jake said. "They watched what you did," she said. "All of them. Many times." She paused. "They asked to be here when you woke up. It was important to them." Jake looked at the 12 warriors. They looked back at him, steady and still. He thought about asking more. He thought about the Kreth officer in the corner, and the formal dress, and the two-handed gesture, and the room that was not built for him, but had been arranged as if it was. Then he decided that he was tired, and his side hurt, and some things could wait until he had slept properly. "Okay," he said simply. He closed his eyes. In the room around him, 12 warriors of the Velsoran elite remained exactly where they were, standing straight and still, watching over a sleeping human who did not yet understand what he had become to them, and who would probably have been quietly uncomfortable if he did. 3 days passed before anyone asked anything official of Jake Mercer. The medical team checked on him twice a day. They were quiet and professional, and worked around him without making him feel like a subject being studied, which he appreciated. His wounds were closing faster than they would have under human care. The Solvari bioweave did its work steadily and without complaint, and by the 2nd day he could move his left arm almost normally. He ate the food that was brought to him, which was not made for human biology, but had been adjusted carefully enough that it sat fine. His body, it turned out, had been waiting for permission. On the morning of the 3rd day, a woman came to his room. Her name was Lena Ford, and she was the Compact's human diplomatic liaison for the outer sectors. A trim, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, with short gray-streaked hair, and the particular kind of calm that came from spending 15 years in rooms where one wrong word could cost something important. She had worked harder, longer negotiations than most people in the Compact ever saw. She had sat across from Solvari commanders and Kreth trade delegates and Denari council members, and never once let anyone see her sweat. She sat down across from Jake and looked at him for a moment, the way a person looks at something they are still trying to fully understand. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Fine," Jake said. "My arm is better." "Good," she said. She folded her hands on the table. "I need to explain what is going to happen today, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." Jake looked at her. "Okay," he said. She explained it carefully and completely. The recognition chamber, the formal citation, the Velsoran mark, what it was, what it meant, how few people outside the Solvari had ever received it. She told him about the footage, about how many people had seen it, and how many times they had watched it. She told him about the Kreth Analytical Bureau's file, which had been quietly passed to the Compact's Human Liaison Office as a gesture that translated roughly as professional acknowledgement. She told him that the council member whose daughter he had kept alive would be present, along with High Commander Vera Solketh, and 12 members of the Vel-Soran elite, and one Kreth observer who had formally requested to attend and been granted permission. She told him all of it in a steady, even voice, and when she was finished, she waited. Jake was quiet for a moment. "Do I have to wear something different?" he asked. Lena Ford looked at him. "No," she said, after a brief pause. "Your jacket is fine." The recognition chamber was large and built in the Solvari style. High ceilings, smooth stone walls in deep blue-gray. Light that came from strips along the floor and gave everything a clean, even glow. It was the kind of room designed to make things feel permanent, to give weight to the things that happened inside it. Jake walked in, wearing his clean jacket, and sat in the chair that had been placed in the center of the room, and he looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong meeting and was too polite to say so. Lena sat beside him, close enough to translate anything he missed. High Commander Vera Solketh stood at the front of the room. She was tall, even by Solvari standards, with the kind of posture that came from decades of carrying authority without needing to announce it. She held a document in both hands and read the formal citation aloud in Solvari standard, while Lena translated quietly into Jake's ear. It was long. It used words like singular valor and preservation of life under conditions deemed unsurvivable, and action taken in the full absence of obligation. It listed every wound he had taken and every decision he had made, drawn from the sensor footage and the recovery team's report. It named the child, Vel Sen Ora, and her status, and what would have happened to her if Jake's transport coupling had not failed on that particular road on that particular day. Jake sat with his hands folded in his lap and listened to all of it without changing his expression. When the reading was done, Vera Solketh stepped down from the front of the room and walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him directly. "You are to receive the Vel-Soran mark," she said. Her human standard was precise and formal, each word placed with care. "It is given only to those whose actions are judged worthy of permanent Solvari memory. In the full history of our people, only 11 individuals who were not Solvari have ever received it." "I appreciate that," Jake said. "I really do." "Do you understand what it means?" she asked. Jake looked at her for a moment. Not the quick, polite look of someone trying to give the right answer. A real look, steady and direct. "It means I did what needed doing," he said. "That is all it ever means." Something moved through Vera Solketh's expression, small and fast, there and then gone. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have heard something that is both simpler and more complete than what they expected. Lena Ford pressed her lips together and looked at the floor for a moment. She had spent 15 years translating human behavior to alien audiences, finding the right words for the right rooms, bridging the distances between species who understood the world in completely different ways. She still found moments like this one almost impossible to explain, not because the words were hard, but because the thing itself, the plain, quiet weight of it, did not really need translating. It just needed to be heard. In the back of the chamber, the Kreth observer stood with his blades fully retracted and his hands open at his sides. He had stood that way through the entire ceremony, still and attentive, watching Jake Mercer with dark, steady eyes. When it was over, he left quietly and filed his report before the day was finished. The report was 3 pages long. The first 2 pages covered the ceremony in careful, factual detail, the citation, the mark, the attendees, the formal statements made. The 3rd page was the conclusion, and it was the page that everyone who received the report read first and then read again. It said, "The original assessment of human unpredictability was not an error. It was an underestimation. Humans do not calculate odds before they act. They calculate outcomes. This is not the same thing. A creature that calculates odds decides whether it can win. A creature that calculates outcomes decides what it is willing to lose." This human decided what he was willing to lose before the fight began. He decided it the moment he heard a small sound and walked toward it instead of away. Everything that followed was the result of that single decision. We do not yet have a model that fully accounts for this. Building one should be considered a priority. The report was classified and immediately read by everyone with clearance. Vel Senora was brought into the chamber at the end of the ceremony. She was wearing a small formal sash in Solvari white and gold, and she was carrying Jake's jacket in both arms, pressed against her chest, because she had refused to put it down since the recovery team had brought it to her, and nobody had felt quite right about forcing the issue. She walked across the chamber floor with the careful, serious steps of someone carrying out a very important task. She stopped in front of Jake and held the jacket out to him with both arms fully extended, the way you offer something back to the person it belongs to when you have been keeping it safe. Jake leaned forward and took it gently from her hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked up at him with large, dark eyes. Then she reached up and took his hand, wrapping all 4 of her small fingers around it and holding on. Jake sat very still. He did not say anything. He just let her hold his hand and looked down at her with an expression that was hard to describe. Not quite a smile, not quite something else, just the face of a man who understood, in that moment, exactly what mattered and exactly what did not. Around the room, 12 elite warriors of the Vel Soran stood without speaking. Nobody felt the need to. Lena Ford looked at the 2 of them, the quiet, unremarkable human and the small alien child holding his hand, in a room full of the most decorated warriors in the Solvari Dominion. And she thought about the report she would write that night. She thought about how she would explain this, what words she would use, how she would make the people who read it understand what it had felt like to be standing in this room. In the end, she wrote it simply, the way the best things are always written. She wrote, "He did not go into that dark place looking for glory. He did not go in calculating what he could gain or what it might cost him. He went because something small and frightened needed him to." And when it was over, he sat down on the floor, pressed his jacket to his side, and told the child she was going to be okay. That is what humans are. Not the weapons they carry, or the wars they have fought, or the medals they have been given. This is what they are, and I believe the galaxy is only beginning to understand it. She submitted the report, closed her screen, and sat quietly for a long time in the dark.